Welcome to Session 2, Revitalising Mining in Europe. In an era marked by rapid change and increasing environmental concerns, the mining sector stands at a pivotal crossroads. Our esteemed speakers will present innovative, forward-looking strategies to enhance the mining industry's role in fostering a sustainable future across Europe. Our discussions will focus on several key topics, starting with visionary 2050 mining scenarios that will help us anticipate and prepare for future challenges. We will also delve into innovative supply chain management approaches, notably the Global Supply Chain Observatory. This initiative aims to increase transparency and resilience within the mining supply chain, ensuring that we can meet the evolving needs of our industry and society. Furthermore, we will highlight the importance of cross-industry collaboration as a means to overcome pressing sustainability challenges. Speakers will underscore the benefits, the importance of integrating ESG factors into mineral resource reporting from the earlier stages to ensure responsible mining practices and attract future investments. Join us as we explore the path toward a resilient and ethical mining industry that is not only responsive to contemporary challenges, but also committed to shaping a sustainable future for generations to come.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on revitalising mining in Europe, leveraging resources and trusted partnership. My name is Anastasia Garland, and it's my pleasure to host this panel. We are navigating a world that is increasingly reliant on critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements that fuel our energy transition and our ambitions for a greener economy. And the European Commission estimates that the demand for these critical raw materials could double by 2030 because it's largely driven by green and digital transitions. Consequently, we need more sustainable and responsible mining practices that has never been more urgent to discuss this now. So today we'll explore how we can revitalise the mining industry in Europe by leveraging our resources effectively and building trusted partnerships across the industries and communities. As you all know, the mining industry has a twin deficit problem: trust and understanding. We hope that we can cover a lot of ground in this today and tomorrow on addressing some of those challenges as well. So in this session, we will explore a number of interrelated themes that are essential for the future, especially mining in Europe. We'll start by setting the future vision and strategic context. And next, we'll dive into the critical role of cross-industry partnerships in fostering sustainability. Following that, we will examine the importance of transparency in critical mineral supply chain. We will then focus on engaging communities and increasing local procurement. Then the focus will shift to a discussion on transparency and balanced reporting. And finally, we will hear from the Czech Battery Cluster. The gentleman is able to join us as a last-minute addition. So at the end of our presentation, we will engage in a collective dialogue through Q&A sessions. Please do have your questions ready for that time. And so let's get started. The first session is on mining scenarios. And according to the World Bank, the global production of minerals like graphite, lithium, and cobalt will need to increase by nearly 500% by 2050 to support the growing demand for clean energy technologies. Clearly, that involves a lot of mining scenarios. So here to talk on mining scenarios is Victor Correa.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you also for starting with the key question. So I'm assuming that everyone is quite familiar with these estimates on how many metals we'll be using in 2050. We'll be using 40 times more lithium or 20 times more graphite. Well, these estimates, they have basic assumptions, being the first one, for instance, in lithium, that we'll be using still lithium batteries. The other assumption might be that, in a way, the governments and trade will be still feasible and, in a way, not very different from what we have today. What I'm talking here, it's something completely different from that. I'll be talking about scenarios that are looking to different realities. And this is something that is useful because if you look to these key assumptions, if they are challenged, we might get a different result. It's also important to underline that it's not easy to do these forecasting exercises. And I'm using this image from the cover of The Economist back in 2000, well, it's the end of 2015. And The Economist, every year they publish a special issue basically highlighting what's coming next. So what will be the next players, if you want, the main drivers of change. And this shouldn't be difficult because drivers of change are basically three. We have the political drivers, you have the social drivers or socio-economical drivers, and you have the technological drivers. But in this case, that's the cover for 2016. And at the end of the year, we had the elections in the US. And this cover is important because there is a missing person there. And it was the person who made a lot of changes in the coming years. I'm talking about, of course, about Donald Trump. And back in 2016, the observatory, we were doing our first scenarios assessment, and we also missed Brexit. Because in that scenario assumption, we created three scenarios. Basically, one was a sort of a scenario where the environmental values will be the driving forces. In that scenario, you could have, for instance, some sort of theocracy or even a dictatorship, but a green dictatorship. We also had a sort of open trade scenario, and we had the national laws. But the Brexit, and of course also Donald Trump, and these were two things that we were not expecting so fast, they really made the national laws almost here. And that's the reason why several years ago, basically 2 years ago, we decided to refresh these scenarios. So as I said, we have these three fundamental drivers of change: socioeconomics, political, and technological. For instance, the technological one, and you have seen the slides in the first session, are the ones that explain why we are using more raw materials. For instance, the political ones are decisions like the Green Deal. And the social ones, I mean, Brexit is probably the best example, and also the election of Donald Trump. So this is a complex process. In the raw materials observatory, we started this refreshment of these scenarios that we prepared almost 2 years ago. And we started from the basics. And the basics is the list of the influence factors. We listed the PESTEL, so the political, economical, social, technological, environmental, and legal dimensions. And then, based on all these dimensions, we try to group them and to understand which ones are really relevant to the raw materials world. We are not talking about geopolitical scenarios, we are talking about scenarios for the industry. And we came up with 23 descriptors. So these descriptors are really, for instance, if we are talking about world population is linked, obviously, with infrastructure. So for the industry, what really counts is infrastructure, because with bigger world population means that we need more roads, we need more buildings. If we need more buildings, we need more steel, and so on. We have this list of 23 descriptors, and based on that, we made projections. And this is where we cross the descriptors with each one. And after these projections, you have a number which is there. And this is the only moment after the projections where we use software. We have made this exercise with the support of Fraunhofer, which, by the way, was also helping us in the first scenarios back in 2016. And in the process, we engage with a wide group of people, not only from Europe, where the International Raw Materials Observatory is based, but also from the United States and from South America. In the end, we have been also validating the descriptors and the projections in a survey, and one of the images that you have there is from the PDAC 2 years ago when we ran this survey. After having the software assessment, we had, as I said, raw scenarios, so these scenarios that were produced based on those descriptors, and we decided to cluster these scenarios into 4 scenarios. For each scenario, you have these descriptions of the international, economic, and social dimensions, but again, mining. And mining, because these are very specific topic scenarios, and on mining, we are looking to demand, to research and development, and to the industry value chain, and of course, to technologies. As I said, we have 4 scenarios, and here you have them across the divides of them. The worst case scenario is on your right low-end side. It's what we call the downward spiral. This is a scenario where the world in 25 years will be basically fractured, so countries will be working in isolation. And in fact, the divide line, it will be these geopolitical rivalries. We are starting to see the rise of something similar to that with the competition between BRICS and NATO countries. So we see this competition might be coming from the religious dimension. It might be caused by political, or if you want, lifestyle values. So it's a possibility. But in the case of the downward spiral, you combine these divides with also with the economic reception. So what we see here is this economic distress, and countries will be basically trapped into that. The 2 scenarios in the middle, one of them, the advancement wave, is very similar to the dot-com bubble. You probably remember what happened 20 years ago when suddenly we realized that the internet is here and we need to have a website. I do remember that not even 20 years ago, perhaps 10 years ago, it was to me a surprise to realize that many people were using the mobile phone to access the internet. I mean, to me, the mobile accessing the internet is something for the computers, not for the mobile phone. And the reality is that these things can change very quickly. So the advancement wave is a sort of scenario where we'll be having something like a dot-com bubble, this time not with the internet, but with multipliers like artificial intelligence or new energy capacity. And then we have the divided dominions. These are sort of similar scenarios. The difference between them, it's the geopolitical rivalry, again, meaning that in the divided dominions is something like the trend that we are beginning to have. The advancement wave, it's a more optimistic future. And then we have the great transition, but about that I will tell you later. So we have these scenarios. They are being launched today, because this is the first time that the International Raw Materials Observatory is talking about them. You have a QR code, and if you go to the website, what you found is not only the scenarios, but also a fact sheet for each scenario, describing many different dimensions. And just let me give you a sort of example. I'll be posting the QR code at the end of the session again. So this divided dominions, remember, this is the scenario. It's not the worst case, but it's a scenario where we be having countries working in isolation. So we'll be having blocks. And what we like to underline here is that in this scenario, the losers and the winners in the industry are different, meaning that companies that are probably trying to look to exploration might be finding themselves in trouble because it's very difficult to get money and to get funds in this sort of scenario, because again, investors, they are not reliant on the fact that you'll be having an operating mine in few years. And of course, in this scenario, you might be okay if you are very close or very aligned with a specific government, because in that case, you might have the support that you need to have your mine. Again, looking to exploration, it's not the best scenario for exploration if you are talking about greenfields, but if you are talking about brownfield, that might be an option. What we have for each scenario, and I'm also presenting this here only for that one as an example, is a list of winners and a list of losers. And in the fact sheet, you also have more. You also have a list of disruptors. So the factors that can, in a way, break and transform that scenario, the ones that will be basically preventing that scenario from happening. What is interesting here is that you see that in this scenario, some of the losers are developing countries. I mean, the fact is that all developing countries who have no mineral endowments will be losing in this scenario. Because in this scenario, countries will be, again, working in blocks, meaning that, and because no economy in the world and no country in the world has all the minerals that the industry needs, so the trade will be inside that block. And because trade will be happen also only inside that block, that means that developing countries will be having less opportunities to trade outside the block. And of course, that only works for the countries who have mineral endowments. Those who have not, they will be, in a way, facing problems. But again, that was not the worst case scenario, but I would say this is probably the most realistic scenario. We call it the advancement wave. It's one that is, as I said before, similar to the internet, to the dot-com boom. In this scenario, the difference between the other and this one is that in this scenario, we'll be having growth. So again, we'll be in blocks, but we'll be having growth within the blocks. And by having economic growth, that means that we'll be having more stable prices. By having more stable for commodities, by having more stable prices, that means that the cycles will be longer. If the cycles are longer, then we'll be having investors. If we have investors, then governments will be also supporting infrastructure. And all these chains are aligned. So if you were policymakers and not only industry players, I'll be here advocating for this scenario. I believe that this is, in fact, what the European Union is trying to have with the Critical Raw Materials Act, is this sort of recognizing that, in fact, we are starting to work in isolation. So we see what's happening now with the competition between China, Russia, if you want, the BRICS country, and the rest of the, let's say, Western world. And for that reason, we are trying to organize ourselves in a way to be self-sufficient. So that's the advancement wave scenario. It's a scenario that, of course, relies a lot on research and development. And then the worst case scenario, the downward spiral. What we see here is each one for himself or for itself, and basically a lot of wars for resources. This is the worst case scenario for investors, and because it's the worst case scenario for investors, is also the worst case scenario for the industry. What we need to do is, if this scenario happens, what or how can my company or how can my organization prepare? Finally, the great transition. This is a sort of dream scenario. And in the discussions that we had, we realized that it's only possible for people to trust again in this global trade, global order, multilateral organizations, if, and this is a very big if there is some sort of previous catastrophe. For instance, a pandemic that kills a lot of people, or a nuclear war. So I'm afraid to say that the best scenario, according to our estimates today, it won't happen unless there is a huge catastrophe. So what is this for? Are you probably thinking now? And I will say that we have two options. Either we choose a scenario and we try to push towards that direction, or we basically try to adapt to 2 or 3 plausible scenarios saying that my organization or my bank or my country will be playing in these different fields, and we are trying to basically minimize the effects of these scenarios. Remember from the lessons from 2016, the case was the Brexit and Donald Trump. We'll be having elections in the US in 3 weeks, and this again can have a change in the world. Also important to say that there is a disruptor there, because as I mentioned before, we have, as drivers of change, political, socioeconomic factors and technological factors. We have now one extra factor, and this is climate change. It never happened before. And we have a multiplier, and this one is artificial intelligence. And it's quite difficult for us to understand what artificial intelligence will be, or how it will be affecting our life in the future. So you have here the QR code. if you just scan it, you go to the website, you have all the information about the scenarios, you have the fact sheets, you have postcards, and in few weeks you will be having also a fact book that details the methodology. In fact, we are just completing that. So feel free to go there. And as I said before, these scenarios were prepared by INTRO, the International Raw Materials Observatory, and by SAFE, who are an American coalition who also partner with us. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Victor, for setting that on the stage. And Sonoris is a great time to be talking about, and we certainly paid attention to all of the 4 scenarios that you were talking about. Now, next up, I feel like the necessity to recap some of the things that were said this morning in the first section, as well as Victor setting that stage on the mining scenarios. I thought it would be only useful to talk about the critical role of cross-industry collaboration in overcoming our sustainability challenges in European mining. And I'd like to say a few words on that. So I'll walk over to that side so you can see me. So I don't have any slides today. Just like a good miner, I like getting my hands on over that discussion. So no slides, but you can look at me if you have to pay attention. So I've spent my career navigating the dynamic intersection of the industrial, energy, and resources industry. And you could say, like, in a metaphorical gold rush sense, I'm like a miner, and just like miners sift through tons of earth to discover hidden treasures, my job has always been involved in delving into the complex challenges to uncover innovative solutions and opportunities that is relevant for my clients. It is an exciting landscape, and I always find collaboration is a trusty pickaxe that allows us all to break through the barriers and dig deep into the rich seams of what this industry has to offer. And let's be honest, sometimes we hit a few rocks along the way, but that's just part of the fun. So, mining doesn't operate in isolation. I'm sure you all agree with me on that when I say that it doesn't operate in isolation, because it exists within a complex ecosystem that demands collaboration amongst various stakeholders. Mining companies, original equipment manufacturers, processing facilities, recycling organization, regulatory bodies, research institutions, and local communities. This is all part of our ecosystem. And each of these entities plays a crucial role in shaping the future of mining, whether it is in Europe or elsewhere in the world, but more in the context of this session in Europe. And we must acknowledge that these interactions, very much so as we move forward in this conversation. Now, the European Commission has projected that by 2030, the EU will require up to 18 million tons of critical raw materials annually. You can also refer to the IEA estimates, and there are several other estimates in the industry which all talk big numbers. And this is all to support our green transition goals. So in response, the Critical Raw Materials Act, which Mark very wonderfully covered in a session and followed with a number of speakers this morning, one of the points is to reduce or source 10% of these materials from domestic markets, 15% through recycling, and 40% through domestic refining. This legislation signals a commitment to fostering innovation and streamlining regulation. And there's a saying that goes, America innovates, Asia replicates, and Europe regulates, and we do that very well here in Europe. However, while focusing on domestic mining, it is essential that we also confront the challenges associated with it. Mining projects typically take 10 to 15 years to launch due to complex permitting procedures. There's an extended timeline can deter investments and slow project developments. Environmental concerns and lack of acceptance from local communities can also impede these mining initiatives. And as I said before, building trust and engaging these communities effectively is paramount. The environmental concerns and the lack of acceptance particularly is exacerbated with the high energy cost, fluctuating commodity prices, and potential labor shortages. These make mining projects less appealing to investors. So we need to create an environment that mitigates these risks. A comprehensive assessment or lack thereof of the EU's geological potential makes it difficult to gauge available resources. And as we saw in the first session, the importance of having these geological projects done. Mining regulations primarily fall under individual member states. This slightly limits the scope of the EU-level interventions. It could improve the conditions, although there is increasing EU-level involvement in the sector that can be seen. But despite these challenges, we have significant opportunities before us, and that's a good news for us to share. As the CRMA, or the Critical Raw Materials Act, proposes strategic initiatives that can benefit from streamlined permitting and enhanced access to financing. We should leverage this support to accelerate operations. Innovation in mining and exploration technologies greatly improve our ability to access geological resources accurately and enhance the feasibility. So one of the things that is important is collaboration among industries will be critical in overcoming all of these challenges and maximizing mining potential in Europe. Partnerships between mining companies, technology providers, and research institutions can encourage innovation in mining, and especially in recycling technologies. This leads to more efficient extraction and processing metals. And again, going back to the first session this morning, a lot of key details were shared in terms of Europe's ability is to bring in that processing capability, and this is where we can do very well. So these sort of collaborations are very relevant in that instance. Collaborations create an integrated supply chain. It ensures steady flow of raw materials from extraction to industries. And industry coalitions can advocate for more favorable regulatory conditions. Collaborative efforts can involve local communities. Education institutions, collaborations with these education institutes can develop specialized training programs, and we saw that a lot of that in the morning session as well. So what I mean to say is revitalizing mining in Europe is both a challenge and opportunity. Now, we can either focus on the challenge or we can focus on the opportunity. I'd encourage you to focus on the opportunities there, because addressing these obstacles we face, such as permitting delays or public opposition, can be effectively addressed and done through collaboration and leveraging each other's strengths. The bottom line is the true strength of the mining industry is not in the depths of our mines, but in the depths of our collaboration. Combining resources and sharing expertise, we build a secure, sustainable supply chain for critical raw materials that supports our economy. So my session is essentially just looking at all of the things that we've talked about in the first session and sort of reiterating the purpose that collaboration is essential if we were to avoid those doom scenarios that Victor had just talked about. So thank you very much. So to move on further from the session, so moving on from that session, we want to move on to building transparency in critical mineral supply chain and how the Global Supply Chain Observatory can help us. And here to tell us more about it is Gary Lawson.
Hi, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to present an overview of our Global Supply Chain Observatory. It's a new project started in around February 2024. It's an open data platform, and it really aims to support the global supply chains through enhancing transparency, sustainability, but more importantly, resilience. Although this work has only really just begun, it is a growing body of work, and I really look forward to sharing more of it with you as we go through. This project was born out of the University of Cambridge Industrial Resilience Research Group. Although there are 14 members of this group, around 6 of us work directly and indirectly on this project. We work with the Department of Science and Innovation, UK Science and Innovation work, and luckily we partner with Google as well for our system infrastructure. So how does transparency of the sort that the Global Supply Chain Observatory is trying to present work? Well, what we actually do is we study events, and these events can indicate some vulnerability. Events plus vulnerability indicates risk. Risk plus mitigation can support resilience. Some people describe resilience as bouncing without breaking, but this is much more than that. One of the first things we need to do is reliably build credibility. At the center of this is the Global Supply Chain Observatory. We work around thematic and practical paradigms. We build formal thematic analysis, systems dynamics, statistical modeling, mapping. And using these broad themes, we can point out our observatory lens in many directions. Here, we're pointing it at specifically critical minerals. So why do we do this? Well, we do this to build insights, and more importantly, actionable insights. And these insights combined provide a fingerprint. And it's these fingerprints within the supply chain is what we're really looking at with the supply chain. That's really what we're searching for. So how do we do this? Well, we do this using tools to build visibility, specifically open data. We use grey data, company reports, geological surveys, weather patterns, imaging, and so on. All the data that you can imagine that would develop some sort of proxy is the type of data that we use. Although there are several ways to directly measure this, there are several ways that we cannot directly measure infrastructure and system changes in real time. So what we do is we then build proxies, and these proxies combined with fingerprints develop those actionable insights to a specific user. So for example, high-level mapping creates top-down visibility of key global locations for processing or deposits or artisan mining and so on, using known fingerprint capacity. We can see concentration of distributions, and more importantly, begin to cross-validate these. Here we can look at supporting the initial identification of concerns, and importantly, production vulnerability. We can then also look around sustainability. We can create visibility into sustainability concerns, again, such as different effects of mining, potential child labour issues, as it can often be associated with. Moreover, we can marry this with potential political instability or political instability markers or particular conflict areas that have a potential to disrupt supply chains and even extreme weather. And it's to that end we can then begin to identify trade flows. Here it is important to identify documented versus actual material trade flows, which often need some type of transformation to actually tell the same story. So this data, and more like it, really needs to support the idea of transparency and into that theme of transparency. And here transparency is about credibility and actionable accountability. The main body of this is imaging. Here we use the Sentinel-5P Air system, and we can get data every 3 hours or every 5 days, depending if it's offline. And this then creates a narrative that we can play into that further data. Here we can then build a visual tool using the grey data that we've explored and also imaging data, and combining these to support that resilience within the supply chain. Linking this then to the Google Earth Engine, we can then begin to build something very powerful and very immediate. For example, air pollution inspection. Here we can make an assessment of air index quality. For example, this would support Scope 3 emissions. Further, we can then make some probabilistic inferences around how we can have actionable capacity, or if a facility is ramping up or if a facility is ramping down. Here this supports the idea of auditing the supply chain to build that resilience and, more importantly, trust. Moreover, this allows high level of validation. Here we can use grey data of open source data to begin to identify the credible sources and to enhance our methodologies. One such further use is vegetation index. Here we can identify areas of land change, not just in the moment, but over time. We can begin to build this then with different types of thematic analysis. Here we can change over time and to get an inference of the sort of mines or potential mines in a particular area or particularly that's being developed. As we overlay these together, these fingerprints grow stronger. The more data that we collate, the more data that we cross-reference, the fingerprints will grow stronger. And then finally, as these tools develop, we then begin to think, how could the usability be improved? Here we develop LLMs to interact with the data so that in a practical environment, we can then begin to share this information with people who are interested in providing sustainability solutions. The observatory intends to develop this over the next year or so. So the Global Supply Chain Observatory is today pointing its lens at critical minerals. It's developing its methodologies around supply chains, and we're here to foster transparency and sustainability across the full life cycle of a supply chain. And I invite you to please work with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for that very insightful presentation. As over 70% of the companies recognize that greater transparency is key to mitigating risk tied to supply chain, as found by a study conducted by the International Council on Mining Metals. I'm sure plenty of people will get an opportunity to interact with this large language model project that you're developing. So thank you very much for that insight. We'll move on down the program. Please welcome Carolyn McIsaac. And Carolyn, yeah. So she will be talking on sourcing mining's social license to operate and the needs and opportunities to increase local procurement. Carolyn, please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. One thing I've realized, having done a few presentations, is I constantly need water. So this is my reminder to myself. Thanks again for having me today. As I said, my name is Carolyn McIsaac, and I work with the Mining Shared Value Program of Engineers Without Borders Canada. And today I'm going to talk a lot about local procurement and opportunities within the mining sector. Right, so here you can see a little bit about us. Essentially, we work to improve the social and economic benefits that go to host countries and communities that choose to host mining operations. And we do this through focusing on the role of local procurement in mining sector activities within the global mining industry. So we have a few areas of emphasis. We act as a resource, we act as a hub, we act as a champion to the issue of local procurement, and we try to gather stakeholders and practitioners to talk more about local procurement in the industry. We're internationally focused, we work wherever a mining sector activity happens, and we're neutral. So we don't necessarily promote specific mining projects, but we do look to advance local procurement when existing mining projects are happening. So why local procurement? I mean, I think that oftentimes there's a real focus on the role of taxes and royalty and local content in regard to employment and obviously increasingly downstream value addition that we talk a lot about today. But local procurement in some cases tends to get missed on the agenda, and really actually there's a lot of value if we focus a little bit more on the local procurement potential. So here you can see that this model here on the right is from the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and they modeled in a 2021 study that looking at mining sector spend, 45% of it goes to procurement. If you look at Anglo American's economic value report over here on the left, when you take away investor returns, 61% of it goes towards procurement. So the numbers kind of speak volumes. Of course, I don't need to necessarily go over this slide again. I think we've talked a lot about the role of the EU Raw Critical Materials Act. And what I really mostly want to focus on today is kind of the high-level benchmark numbers around 10% of domestic capacity, 15% in recycling, 40% around refinery and processing. And where does local procurement actually fit into this? So here, I want to introduce a bit of a tool. And kind of the session today, I hope to make a bit practical in terms of tools and best practices that really we can reach upon to leverage local procurement. The local procurement reporting mechanism is something that we created back in 2019 with the help of funding from the German Development Agency. And we have about 13 mining companies that have now used the LPRM to track and report on their local procurement spend. And some of the disclosures, taking it back, there's a few sets of different types of disclosures that mining companies can use to report on local procurement. So one of the basics ones, for example, is, does the mining company have a local procurement policy? As simple as that, do they put that on their website? A next one might be, are the contacts of the procurement department on the publicly available? Because sometimes suppliers just simply don't know who to contact. Another one might be, do they actually publicly report on how much spend is going towards local procurement? And do they define the categories in which they track procurement by? So for example, maybe a company looks at local procurement, national procurement, international procurement, and is that clear on their website and how much spend goes towards each categories? Then you can get more into the high-level categories that really we encourage mining companies to look at. And so that would be things like, is there additional commitments to the communities around local procurement? So for example, some companies will be operating mining operations on Indigenous territories, for example, in Canada. And so those companies may have specific agreements with those communities that include things like local procurement. That's a common practice in Canada. They have impact benefit agreements oftentimes with local communities. So those would be some examples. They might have additional commitments to women-owned suppliers, certain types of suppliers would be included in that. So here's an example of a company that actually has used local procurement. So this is Ivanhoe Mines, and Ivanhoe Mines is listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange, but they've got sites all over. We recently visited one of their sites in South Africa back in June, and they adopted the LPRM back in 2019. And this is kind of an example of how they've been able to use it. And sometimes they just put the reporting mechanism at the end of their sustainability report or their annual report, for example. But here you can see that they actually state that, for example, they have an enterprise supplier development department. They have specific preference to local suppliers and scoring of bids. And these are just some of the companies that have used the LPRM to date. So now that I've given you a potential tool that you can look at to potentially adopt as a mining company or to just look at to help guide procurement efforts. And I should say that I'm talking about mining companies specifically, but I think this is a really good tool for major suppliers that are working in the industry that would like to increase procurement within their own supply chains. Renewable energy sector as well can look at the LPRM as guidance for increasing local procurement as we continue to look at local content within the energy sector. So some examples of best practices. This is an example of a mining company operating in Sweden. We've not actually worked with them, but I just went on their website and looked at how do they actually display tabs for suppliers. And here you can see that they have a specific tab for current opportunities for suppliers. So it's very easy for a potential supplier to know exactly what opportunities exist. They have FAQs. They have a specific page for who to contact if suppliers have questions around local procurement. For current suppliers, they also have technical instructions, a supplier code of conduct, and also training opportunities that exist for suppliers. Many mining companies will already have this information. Sometimes the issue tends to be that they actually just don't display it publicly, so suppliers don't actually know what opportunities exist. This is another example, going back to Ivanhoe Mines in South Africa. We were really, very impressed actually by what they're doing around local procurement at their site in Mokopane. And some of this is due to, in South Africa, there's more regulation around local procurement because of broad-based Black economic empowerment. So a lot of companies will start to encourage local procurement within their supply chains as part of scoring criteria for that. But you can see they have a specific community-based website, and on that website, they have a specific tab where suppliers can access the supplier portal. They also have a PDF detailing exactly what suppliers would need to know about their procurement opportunities. They have an expression of interest page, and also you can see, which is really quite amazing, is in their sustainability report. They actually show here how they defined the different categories of suppliers. And as I mentioned before, most companies might have 2 or 3 different categories of suppliers that they track, but they actually have 7. So you can take a look here. And they have foreign, national, provincial, local community, and host. And the idea around that is now they can kind of start to increase, to over time shift their spend closer and closer to the host community. And they've been able to do that through tracking these categories really diligently. And finally, I'll just highlight that they have, as I mentioned before, a specific department that works on enterprise development. And this is separate from the supply chain department that actually awards bids. And they focus a lot on supporting enterprises, but also on partnership and joint venture models. And so what they've done is that with some of their major suppliers that bid for procurement opportunities, they've put clauses that they should be looking at opportunities to partner with local suppliers. And the advantage to some of these major companies is that they can actually choose which local suppliers they work with. And the idea is that this not only increases procurement opportunities, but actually real economic change within the communities because these local suppliers end up having ownership and stake in these projects. Great. So as I get closer to the end here, I just want to outline a few other practical best practices that can be taken away today. The first one is around adaptive procurement. Oftentimes what we hear from suppliers is that they just don't know what went wrong in their bids. They haven't received any feedback, they don't know what has gone wrong, and they don't know how they can improve. And so what we recommend is, if possible, mining companies to actually look at opportunities to provide feedbacks, at least to local suppliers. And sometimes this is just done through having kind of a basic form. You don't have to do super bespoke feedback to every single supplier, but have a list maybe. Maybe the issue is that they haven't provided all the necessary documents, or maybe it's an issue around quantity or price. And so, for example, you could check that off, send off an email to a local supplier, and then they have an idea of where they went wrong, which increases transparency. Unbundling of contracts is another one. So sometimes companies will look at procuring certain services or products from one major supplier, but there actually might be an opportunity to break down those opportunities into smaller contracts to be able to support some local suppliers in the area. The next one is flexible payments. Local suppliers, sometimes that are just getting started out, have cash flow issues, and so it really helps to be paid on time, and depending on the company, sometimes they'll have longer payment windows after they've supplied the contract. So, for example, Rio Tinto and Gold Fields have actually made provisions that they'll have flexible payment terms for local suppliers. And then the final one there is preferential contracts. And this is one that I think has to be given a bit more attention because it shouldn't necessarily be used in all cases. It really should be used in certain cases to build capacity of certain types of suppliers that in the end then can deliver on long-term contracts. So that one needs to be taken a bit carefully, but a consideration for certain types of agreements you may have with communities. Last slide here is really about dialogue, and I think this goes back to when we talk about the social license to operate and creating transparency and trust within communities, have conversations with communities. So what some actual mining companies will do is they'll form joint committees, and those committees will have representatives from the communities, from economic development corporations, or whoever's best placed to be on those committees to discuss procurement opportunities. They'll have conversations around advance notice, if there's advance notice that can be given to local contractors to be able to prepare their bids in advance, to talk about specifications and quantities of products, and just generally to voice other concerns and opportunities. So that was kind of a quick overview of some opportunities to enhance local procurement, but please let me know if you have any questions. I'll be around afterwards, and if you want to talk more about the LPRM and how that can be used in a practical sense. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that insightful conversation. There are research from several outlets, including World Bank, that indicates that local procurement can enhance economic benefits of communities by up to 20%. This creates a sense of ownership and reducing conflict. So thank you very much for sharing your insights and the benefits of that. Well, that sort of segues nicely into our next session, which is on responsible mining, having a balanced approach to mineral resource reporting. So please join me in welcoming Robert Goddard and Emily Harris and Robert.
Okay, hi everyone. So my name's Rob Goddard. I'm a resource geologist at SRK in the UK. And on the theme of the introduction to this session, these slides were put together on the basis of a collaboration between multiple mining disciplines, and therefore I'm presenting along with Emily Harris, who's a ESG specialist also at SRK. So our presentation through case study illustration introduces a collaborative workflow methodology that's aligned with mining industry good practice that ensures that there is a balanced yet practical approach for incorporating essentially ESG, environment, social and governance, in mineral reporting at an early stage, for example, in exploration project review, and also when you're considering reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction, or RPEEE, as it's so called, in mineral reporting at the very start of a mineral project. Okay, so to set the scene, I mean, as we're all aware of here, ESG is becoming increasingly important consideration in mineral reporting codes. As we also all know, ESG can have significant implications for a mineral project. But just to illustrate that point, just by taking a recent international example, but with equal relevance to Europe. So if we take the McPhillamys gold project, that is a feasibility level gold project in New South Wales in Australia. It was a mine life, and sorry, this is an article from earlier this year. It had a mine life of 10 years. It had an NPV of 200 million US dollars. And essentially the mine's progress was halted due to, it was found that the mine design's footprint was encroaching on an area of cultural and indigenous importance. So that meant the mine's permit footprint was reduced in size. That in turn meant the project no longer had positive economics. Therefore, on a resource perspective, this meant that the mineral resource no longer had reasonable prospect for eventual extraction, and therefore the resource was effectively retracted. And so the consequence being significant negative consequences for all those financially invested in the project. So for this example, it's important to note that it's only that recently that ESG has been considered with more rigor at an earlier stage, whereas up until recently, typically this wasn't done until a more advanced stage in a mineral project. But these things are changing, and in particular due to some recent changes to several of the mineral reporting codes, and Emily's going to introduce that a bit more on the next slide. We're going to then introduce a case study and how we've gone about practically incorporating, looking at ESG at an early stage in mineral reporting and in exploration, and then we're going to finish up with some key takeaways. So I'll hand over to Emily now.
Thanks, Rob. We're in a period of change, and I think we're seeing an evolution of the disclosure requirements for ESG in the mineral reporting codes. You can see there's quite a diversity of codes, and their date of update probably reflects the level in which ESG is incorporated. So the overarching Crisco template brought in sustainability considerations more clearly in 2019. And since then, we've seen a larger uptake of disclosure requirements sitting directly within these reporting codes. And I've just chosen 3 examples for this audience. The Pan-European Reporting Code includes a requirement for ESG in all reports, including in the reasonable prospects assessment. But I suppose the two most prevalent codes are the Canadian and the Australian codes. And in 2023, the CIM brought in guidelines that recommend including ESG modifying factors to resources as well as reserves. And then the latest exposure draft from JORC requires ESG to be considered when reporting exploration targets, as well as resources and reserves, as well as documenting a reasonable prospects assessment. So while ESG has been good practice for the last decade, what's changing is the need to disclose this in a transparent way and to assess these requirements very explicitly when preparing mineral reports.
Okay, so I mean, the challenge is, how to practically embed these considerations in an exploration project at an early stage, and the challenge is twofold. Both for the exploration company, in a context of what ESG data should be collected in a time poor, cash poor, data poor environment, and particularly in context of the challenges of exploration and mining in Europe. So that there are also challenges for the independent review specialist in terms of how to practically go about the ESG assessment with respect to RPEEE in the context that this is a relatively recent change, and so there's no current industry standard procedures as yet, other than to look at what the material ESG risks are. So we're going to introduce our case study and how we went about addressing this challenge with respect to early stage exploration review. So the project in question is a real-world example. It was at an early stage exploration. It had less than 20 drill holes at the project. It was a gold project with a history of artisanal mining, which highlighted there were several prospective drilling targets on the project. And our involvement in the project was to essentially conduct a 3D block modeling exercise for gold mineralization and assess the RPEEE of that project at a pre-mineral resource stage, ultimately to guide the client whether there was value in continued exploration drilling at the project. So in terms of how the standard approach of going through the RPEEE assessment ahead of mineral reporting considerations, to take your exploration data, produce a model, as you can see on the left there, and then ultimately decide whether is it more likely than not that you're reasonably going to be able to generate a mine at that project in the future. And that's typically done through considering benchmarking of technical and mining economic parameters with a view to coming up to a mining cutoff grade and a conceptual pit shell to demonstrate whether there's that reasonable prospects is there. So in our adjusted version of this workflow, through collaboration with the ESG team, we've embedded a phase of ESG screening at the very fore of the process. And this means that if there are any clear red flags at that point, that may potentially negate the need to do the rest of the RPEEE assessment. Or at the very least, it means you can do the rest of the economic type assessment with a very clear transparency on what the ESG risks are. And importantly, you can then go forward with the context of what the local constraints might be to conceptual mining footprints, for example, be it major drainage courses, sites of ecological or cultural importance, or protected habitats. And Emily's just going to touch on a bit more about the case study.
So what we wanted to generate was a systematic process, and Rob and I worked collaboratively across disciplines to generate this, which is why we're presenting together today. We wanted to have a process that used the available material information. This was not about adding additional tasks for the client to conduct. It was about using the information they already had, but drawing more from it. So the starting point was to establish the criteria, and that was driven around the future code that the client was aiming to report a resource against. In this case, it was the JORC code. And so we were focusing on the status of mineral environmental approvals, status of compliance, looking at stakeholders, and looking at the material, environmental, and social factors. And a critical part of this process is really understanding the context. Those material factors are very context specific. And so we used an environmental constraints, context and opportunities application where we were really looking to understand that site in more detail. And I've just put up an image here to explain one of these. When we screened for protected areas, for example, for this project, the closest protected area was about 50 k's away. But actually, when we did more research on the context, we could see the drainage of this exploration area, which you can see in the red square, is draining towards the coast. And in the coast, it was draining to a bay. And through further research, we were understanding that this bay was highly sensitive in terms of containing endangered species. It had very sensitive habitats. There were tourism hotels, diving sites. So we understood very quickly that although biodiversity wasn't flagging from a very coarse review of the project area, it was certainly going to be driving decisions further down the line when project development processes were continuing. So we were really trying to identify where these material risks were sitting, both in terms of challenges and opportunities, so that we could identify a series of actions for the client to be aware of, and we also supported them to prioritize those. Thanks. So we had a large matrix, which I'm not sharing today because it was full of lots of words, but I'm just giving a snapshot dashboard summary of the outputs. There were no major ESG-related red flags with respect to RPEEE, which was good news for Rob. He could continue with some of the other disciplines in that assessment. But what we were trying to do was add value, and we were trying to identify areas where, although this information wasn't required immediately, it would be required for resource reporting, and encouraging particular actions to help the client move towards a position where they would be in a better place to provide information that would be needed once resource reporting arrived. So that, for example, was the exploration license, the environmental approvals had many conditions in them, and although the client was aware they were in compliance, there wasn't any evidence. So we were trying to suggest actions that would provide evidence of this, similarly around surface rights and their stakeholder engagement, bringing together an evidence base that would then form the basis ready for their resource reporting process. So the highest priority items did sit around the governance space, although we were identifying issues that, although we're not playing out so much in the exploration phase, they would become more important as the project progressed. So they were sitting in the medium and low categories. So we feel that by undertaking this assessment, we've provided a series of actions and priorities that help inform the exploration planning process, informs the future discussions as the project moves towards project development, and obviously prepares the client for that future mineral resource reporting process.
Thanks, Emily. So on the basis that there were no show-stopping red flags identified, we were able to continue to the more mining and technical, typical part of the RPEEE assessment, and that was essentially to generate a conceptual pit shell, or to see if we could generate one based on some sensible input parameters and the block model. So that involved essentially benchmarking to take some reasonable mining processing costs, benchmarking for mineral processing recoveries and geotechnical parameters, along with consensus market gold prices. And essentially, we were able to generate a conceptual mining pit shell shown in blue for the project, mainly focused on the oxide sources of the mineralization. And what we also did was to run a sensitivity of this pit shell based on flexing the inputs a nominal plus or minus 20% to test the robustness of that pit shell, essentially because the inputs that we're using at the moment were all benchmarked and not based on specific test work, as is typically the case at this early stage of the project. And to summarize that quite neatly on a benchmarking chart, we can see here, the circles in red show the tonnage and grade inventories of the pit shells run for the case study project. And the dots in green are essentially regionally nearby operating gold mines and their grade and tonnage inventories. And you can see a cluster there in the black ellipse. So some of the key takeaways were that, broadly speaking, we can say that mineralization at this project occurred at grades that were attractive to open pit mining. However, the other thing that was clear, that the tonnage was relatively on the low side when you compare it to what's currently in operation. And so whilst the takeaway was that, RPEEE was not easily positively supported on that basis with respect to an economic assessment, there was certainly good merit in continuing with exploration drilling on the project, such that with a view to ultimately adding tonnage and hopefully then being able to positively support that RPEEE from an economic perspective, and then doing so in a positive light, there were no ESG red flags identified at this stage that could trip you up at a later development stage. So to conclude with our key takeaways from the exercise and the case study, what we were able to do was to embed a responsible practice in the RPEEE assessment at an early stage, and ensuring that we were able to put ESG right at the fore of the process and assess with equal rigor as you might do the typical mining and economic parameters in this type of assessment. There are several benefits for the project in incorporating ESG at this stage. Include de-risking of those potentially ESG factors that we know have potential for impacting on the viability of the project at a later stage. From our client's perspective, it demonstrates commitment to responsible mining, which is fast becoming more and more of a key consideration in the industry. It's a positive step for the client for attracting future investment in the project, should they want to do that. And this was something that we were able to achieve in our commission fairly quickly and at relatively low cost. And I think the cost of the ESG component was less than 10% of the total commission cost. And so we can say that it was achieved at relatively little inconvenience for the exploration company. Importantly, our workflow is easily adaptable to the evolving or constantly evolving mineral reporting codes. And that's a key consideration, given that we're seeing ESG modifying factors being embedded at earlier stages in mineral reporting considerations. And finally, it's important that this is something that can be easily adapted to any other project, any other exploration project, be it worldwide or based in Europe alike. And so that brings us to the ends of our slides. And so we look forward to any questions that you may have. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Robert and Emily, for that insightful case study. We're moving on to the last segment, and it's about technology clusters. Regions with technology clusters have seen an increase in investments, boosting innovation and development, particularly on critical mineral processing. Here to share some insights with us, please welcome Jan Weber from the Czech battery cluster.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for having me. My name is Jan Weber. I'm the executive manager of the Czech battery cluster, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me at this conference. The batteries are a buzzword. Also, I would like to speak what Czech battery cluster is, what do we represent, what is our goal. Happy quite actually that I can be here in the trench, which is our responsibility, because we think and we strive for that batteries are being produced not only in Czech Republic, European Union, but in a worldwide sense, in a circular way, which is attainable and which is sustainable. First, maybe this may be not so unfamiliar to you, but we tend to explain what the cluster is, because we have in Czech Republic a lot of, I would say, some basic associations. Whereas when we were established only 2 years ago, we were pushed that when you do something from scratch new, do it in a different way. And in the West, where we are always looking and inspiring ourselves, we say that we were told that a cluster is something, it's a great opportunity of a cooperation between the state, high schools or universities and the private sector. And that we should aim not to be a simple association, although I know how difficult it is to run well an association, but we should strive more, and we should immediately become a cluster of a Western type, meaning that in the end, if we achieve it, a cluster, greatly working cluster is I would say some kind of shortcut that, for example, if a new legislation is to come or is to be proposed, or something from the state schools or companies, there is a good idea or something to affront. Through a cluster, you can have really a shortcut how to give a perception, how to get an idea, how to work with that new challenge. So this is what we strive for. We are, excuse me, they call it this picture a triple helix. So we try to foster a triple helix, a cooperation between state, which is in the Czech Republic through Ministry of Industry, through the agency called Czech Invest. If you wish to invest in Czech Republic, you will do it. You can do it. You don't need to, but you can with the help of Czech Invest. And it's a cooperation with Czech high schools. Out of the 6 technical schools which are in Czech Republic, 2 of which are really close to here, High School of Chemistry, for example, 5 of them are our members. And finally, we got about 25 companies so far. So, a brief summary. We were established in 2022 in Brno, our second largest city. We're a bottom-up organization with a 3-headed board. We got a small secretariat or administration body of 1.5 full-time jobs. One of them is standing in front of you. And we are assembling all active players in Czech Republic who are active across the whole battery value chain, which I'm going to speak more about later on. We are quite proud that we, from June 2024, we are the member of European Battery Alliance, which is actually overheading association of all battery associations in Europe, one of 3 or 4, I think. One thing which I would like to stop at, because it's quite intriguing and funny. You would ask, how come that you establish a battery organization only in 2022? I've been active in batteries, so I would say the batteries have become a buzzword only through lithium-ion batteries. And lithium-ion batteries can be purchased, are being offered on the market since 2008. The situation is very specific in Czech Republic because even this wonderful hotel and its architecture, it's historic remnant that we used to be under communism. It is a Stalinistic structure. And at these times, we were told, or we were living behind an iron curtain. And that's a funny bridge, because what the situation in the Czech region is in terms of batteries, that for a very long time, and not only batteries, but only with renewable sources of energy, we are said that we are living behind a green curtain. Batteries, green renewable sources of energy, are not very popular and have not been very popular in Czech Republic from 2010 onwards. Why? Because we have a big car sector, by the way, which doesn't like electric cars at all. But what was quite funny, that only like 2 years back, all the people in Brussels, people from schools, companies, they were saying, okay, I want to cooperate on batteries, either it's mining, either it's first life, second life, it's car making. Where is the hub organization? There was none. In 2022, there was no organization, whereas all in the world, there were hub organizations about batteries. Not in the Czech Republic. Anyway, as people in Czech Invest call it, there were still islands of positive deviation. The list of them, which are in Czech Republic, are our members. Currently, we are 36 up until today. It's in Czech. In the bottom, it says our member list to the 1st of September. Excuse me for my Czech. And all these players are, or can be distributed to the graph. You see, this is the whole battery value chain as we see it. It's nothing new we would come up with. It's a general, I would say, worldwide distinction, or how you can divide business, universities and state work agencies, how you can divide them when you want to produce batteries. That's the battery value chain. Here, I would say we are mostly, or you are mostly present in the first at 12 p.m. a.m. So you are active in extraction of basic materials, and maybe materials for battery production, production. What is very important is that in the middle of it, we see the educational process, because you need labor force, working force for the battery business. It's currently the situation in the Czech Republic is, excuse me, I would show it quite fast. This is how being behind a green curtain looks like. If you see a blind spot in the middle of, in the heart of Europe, that's Czech Republic, and there are no gigafactories planned in Czech Republic still in 2024. I'm not saying that a gigafactory is a complete must, but the reason there is no gigafactory so far planned in Czech Republic is not that it would be meant, well, we were not striving much for it at all, but one of the downsides of it is that even when we are going back to the students and preparing new generation, anybody who wants to be active in the upstream, which is where you go, the mining and also preparation of cathode materials, but also those people who want to be active in the after the production and in the other chains of the value chain, they have to run, not necessarily run, they have to go away from Czech Republic, and we are not sure whether they are going back once we have in the future some gigafactory. So this is, if I get back, this is why we put in the center of the whole value chain the preparation of future brains, of future hands of labor force, which is currently very difficult to foster and to promote in here, because there is not much business in it. Quite funnily, you can always turn a negative or some downside into an upside. Czech Republic is now being in communication with Korean company KHNP about the building of their, or refurbishing of the Czech nuclear power plant. And the Koreans want to bring together research and development center, which would be the, I would say, collective center for research and development of batteries, even for Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and they want to build it here. Does anybody want to try to guess why do they want to build it here behind the green curtain? There is LG factory in Poland and 2 Korean factories, Samsung and SK Innovation in Hungary. I will not tease you for long. They took our disadvantage of being behind the green curtain as an advantage. Hey, there is no competition for us. So it is quite contrived that in the end we can draw extra points that because there is no competition, because we were sleeping behind, lagging behind. So now the Koreans want to build a research development facility here. So I will have to be running more. So the very important figure is that batteries which need a lot of materials mined, 70% or up to 75% of batteries which are now worldwide produced, lithium-ion batteries, which are now produced worldwide, are used in automotive sector. So automotive sector is the key pushing force of whether we need more batteries or less. And by the way, Czech Republic used to be per capita for a very long time the biggest producer of cars, personal cars in the world. We have been only overtaken by Slovakia, which is our, we sometimes say smaller brother, but we have been overtaken by them only by the fact that we are 10 million and they are 5 million. So per capita, statistically, they produce even more. But apart from this, we are also big builders of buses, trucks, and trams and trains, which are the means of transportation that are being electrified too. So this is one of the pushing factors why here in the Czech Republic we need battery business. These are the businesses that are currently supplying, or that are OEMs that are supplying our car production in the Czech Republic, and which on one hand can be seen as being endangered by battery business and electric mobility, but also they could look at it as as a possibility of new businesses. And my final slide, not to speak only about car business, is also where the possibilities for mining. You know that European Union has recently adopted the Critical Raw Materials Act. And when looking, if we want to cut us off the dependency on Asian and mostly Chinese production of batteries, it is not only about mining, it is also about refining. Here in Czech Republic, we hold a strong asset for whole European Union production of lithium batteries in two critical materials. One is lithium, which could, where the deposits are, is the blue spot. Oh, there is no laser. In the blue spot northwest, on the border with Germany, there is Mountain Zinovec, where there are about 3% deposits of lithium in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And last but not least, we have a huge and probably the most or the only easily achievable resource of manganese, which is here in Czech Republic in Mangan Chvaletice. I think the representative of Mangan Chvaletice, Mr. Otava, is with us here. So this is actually, so this is what Czech Republic can do for the European battery independency on Asian market. And this is when you want to do something with lithium batteries, but not only lithium batteries, but anything with batteries and in the value chain. If you want to do something here, I will be glad to help you and assist you in your business. Thank you for your time.
I understand that we are standing between you and lunch. Jan, please join us here for a moment, if you don't mind. I know the light is harsh, but you'll enjoy for a few minutes. So, Arthur, how are we on time? We don't want to keep you away from lunch, so but what we'll do is we'll see if the audience has any questions. I do have prepared questions, but I'll follow Mark's lead here, and I say, throw this out open. So if you've got any questions that we could take on. There you go, the gentleman there. Go ahead.
Thanks. I have a question for Gary. Sorry, Rita, I wanted to ask you about scenarios that to involved in it. So Gary, you presented us the observatory that you're developing. How does this observatory fit into the needs of member states that CRM Act imposes on them to follow the material flow of commodities on the national level? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So one of the original objectives of the observatory was to support that. So at the beginning, at this stage, we're at the very beginning. We don't know what it'll look like in the end, but the idea was to help businesses, companies, NGOs, and more broadly governments to understand those material flows. Although at this stage it's a relatively small project to be taken from rather than a large national sort of perspective. We could see it growing more broader, but the aim is to be credible. So we prefer to be credible in a small space than to be largely not credible in a more broader space. So we're taking it from a small step perspective, and we're taking a couple of critical minerals at a time, and whether that relates to country A or country B will be seen. Currently, we're working with India to support that, support the objective that you've specifically mentioned.
Great, thank you for that question. Do we have any other question from the floor? Go for it, sir.
Actually, since nobody raised their hand, and I'm going to ask Peter now regarding the scenarios. You've shown us 4 very distinctive scenarios, but the picture is most probably a sort of mixture between several or 2 of them. So how do you envisage crossover from one scenario to another? Thanks.
Well, thank you for the question. In fact, the scenarios are narratives, so you can have four distant narratives. And one thing that we can say, in a way, it's easier to forecast on these 25 years term than it is to know who win the US elections. But what we know is that this, in a way, it frames the possible futures. And we know that in between you might have your position in 2050, it's also important to underline that moving from one scenario to the other one is not necessarily a step-by-step approach. It might be a jump. So you can move quickly from one scenario to the next one, and this is what we have seen in the recent past. I mean, the war in Ukraine, the war in Palestine, all these things are coming like in turmoil, so they might change the future. And we don't know, as I said before, what will be the impact of artificial intelligence. But this is coming, and it will make us having these jumps. This is our perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just wrap this up so you can all go have lunch, and I'll join you as well. My question to the panelists, one last round before we leave. As we look to revitalising mining in Europe, what is the single most critical action from each of your perspective or an initiative that should be prioritised to ensure a sustainable, transparent and a resilient mining future that also encourages trusted partnerships across industries and communities? And you can distill this down from your own point of view. So, Jan, may I start with you, if you don't mind?
Well, definitely, I think that especially when you're in elections in China, there's a lot of opposition to build an EU in Czech Republic, but there's an awful nature of the work that Mangan colleagues did about speaking about with all the communities around. So definitely, because there's now a lot of negative looking at electric vehicles and battery stuff, I think that there's big needs. Because this transformation will come anyway to speak with the audience, whether these are communities, political parties, where to explain this. So there is no nimbism. There is a big nimbism in Czech Republic. There is no nimbism at all levels, and to explain that this transformation is coming anyway, and that's. But not to make it look that it's a push. It's a direct push, it's government. It really needs to be well spoken to the people, and then into the cars, electric cars, batteries. Let's not make this product a victim of this political push.
Thank you. Caroline?
Yeah, I would say just echoing some of that around transparency and talking directly with communities and true engagement. I think that we're called mining shared value because the idea is that there can be shared value in this, and there can be a lot of shared value at the local level. And I think it's looking beyond just immediate opportunities, but looking at the long-term economic benefits of the two communities. And so when we talk about local procurement, we don't just look at opportunities to procure from the mine, but where's the diversification involved in that, and how is that thought about from the onset, and how are those conversations started from the beginning? There's procurement opportunities right from construction and mine and exploration, right down to closure and remediation. So, really, where is that true partnership model and shared value? And I think by having that transparency from the beginning, you can create really good dialogue with communities that see these opportunities as benefits if they're done well.
Thank you. Robert, Emily, from your point of view?
Yeah, just quickly from my point of view, it's aligned to our presentations. I'd say that one action should be to make sure that we are all practically embedding ESG early in the mineral assessment process. I guess from the point of view that we need to bring critical minerals online in Europe. If we're not looking at ESG early, the potential that can trip a project that can slow it down in the latter stage of development. So in order to ensure an efficient, sustainable process, just to make sure we get that ESG in there up front.
Excellent. Emily?
Yeah, if I can just extend what Rob said, I think from reviewing a lot of projects across Europe, the ones that are really gaining traction are the ones that are building on the opportunities and offering something else. It's not just the mineral extraction, there's something else coming along with it. And that relates to solving a particular challenge that is relevant to that site and that site-specific context. So you need the engagement to understand what the challenge is, and then you need that information early enough to build the solution into the project design, because I think that really is where the permitting then gets easier, the engagement and the relationships get easier because you're offering something else, not just extraction of a mineral.
Well said. Gary, please.
Yeah, I think I want to echo the ESG side, but as well, just to add on around data openness, data transformation and availability. That I think is critical to bring in a transparent perspective of the domain.
So Victor, take us home.
Yes.
One key point.
Okay, so assuming that in the future we'll still be living in democracy, and that's an important assumption, I will say that it's transforming stakeholders into shareholders. Because if communities are not only stakeholders, but if they become shareholders of the mine, that will transform the acceptance. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to you, audience, and to my panelists for this insightful conversation. We hope you found this valuable and thought-provoking. We're getting out of your way. Please go and enjoy yourselves, have some lunch, and thank you very much for your participation and for listening to us. Thank you.